The auction block was the last place Ruby Langston ever thought she'd find herself standing, heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang trying to break free. Men with hungry eyes and dusty boots lined up before her, each one holding a numbered paddle and a wad of cash, ready to bid on the pretty young woman in the tattered blue dress who still couldn't believe her own stepmother had put her up for sale like cattle. Ruby clutched her hands together to hide their trembling as the spring sun beat down on her exposed neck in Yerington, Nevada, 1878. The small mining town had seen its share of desperate dealings, but even the most hardened locals whispered in disapproval at the sight of Meredith Langston selling her own stepdaughter to cover gambling debts. "I start the bidding at $50 for this fine young woman," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the town square. 19 years old, healthy, can cook, clean, and sew. Would make a fine wife or housekeeper. Ruby felt her face burn with shame. Her father had been dead barely 6 months, and his new wife had wasted no time squandering what little money they'd had. When the debts mounted, Meredith had found a solution in Nevada's shadier laws, a contracted marriage auction that skirted legality through carefully worded documents and well-paid officials. $55, called a man with yellowed teeth and fingers stained with tobacco. 60, shouted another, whose belly strained against his belt. Ruby kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. She'd been raised properly by her real mother before consumption took her 3 years ago. Her father's remarriage had been the beginning of her undoing, culminating in this moment of utter humiliation. $100. A new voice rang out, deeper and clearer than the others. The crowd parted slightly, revealing a tall figure at the back. The man wore a dusty black Stetson pulled low over his eyes, but Ruby could make out a strong jawline covered in the shadow of a beard. Unlike the others, he stood straight, one hand resting casually on his gun belt. 100 from Mr. Carson Black. The auctioneer announced with renewed enthusiasm. "Do I hear 110, 120? Shouted the man with the tobacco-stained fingers. The stranger at the back tilted his head slightly. $200, he said calmly. A murmur rippled through the crowd. $200 could buy a decent plot of land or several head of cattle. For a wife of questionable standing, it was a small fortune. 200 going once. The auctioneer called, scanning the crowd with gleaming eyes. 250. Called a burly miner whose hands were permanently blackened from his trade. The stranger didn't hesitate. $500. The square fell silent. Even Ruby's stepmother, who stood to the side counting her anticipated profits, gasped audibly. $500 going once, going twice. The auctioneer could barely contain his excitement. Sold to Mr. Carson Black. Ruby felt her legs go weak as the crowd dispersed, some muttering in disappointment, others in awe at the extravagant sum. Her stepmother rushed forward, hand extended greedily toward the tall stranger who had just purchased Ruby's future. "A pleasure doing business, Mr. Black," Meredith purred. "I have the contract right here for you to sign." Carson Black approached slowly, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. As he drew closer, Ruby finally got a clear view of her buyer. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with striking blue eyes that contrasted with his sun-bronzed skin. A thin scar ran along his left cheekbone, and his expression remained unreadable as he studied the contract Meredith thrust toward him. He produced a leather pouch from inside his coat and counted out $500 in front of the auctioneer and Meredith. After signing the papers with a flourish, he took the contract and tucked it into his coat. "She's all yours now," Meredith said with false sweetness, already turning away to count her money. Carson Black placed a gentle but firm hand on Ruby's elbow. "My wagon's this way, Miss Langston." Ruby had no choice but to follow, her small carpet bag of possessions clutched in her trembling hands. She'd heard stories of girls sold as wives or worse. Despite his seemingly generous purchase, she had no illusions about what this stranger might expect from her. They walked in silence past the general store and the saloon to where a wagon stood waiting, hitched to two strong bay horses. When they reached it, Carson Black turned to face her, those piercing blue eyes studying her face. "Can you ride?" he asked abruptly. Ruby nodded, confused by the question. "Yes, sir." Without another word, he hoisted her bag into the wagon and then, to her surprise, lifted her onto the wagon seat before climbing up beside her. He took up the reins but didn't immediately set the horses in motion. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew the contract. Ruby watched, bewildered, as he pulled a matchbox from his pocket, struck a match and held it to the corner of the document. "What are you doing?" she gasped as the paper caught flame. Carson held the burning contract between two fingers, watching as the flames consumed the writing. "I'm not in the habit of owning people, Miss Langston." Ruby stared in disbelief as the ashes of her indentured future scattered in the breeze. "But you paid $500. Consider it the price of your freedom." His voice was gruff, but not unkind. "I've got a ranch about 20 miles north of here. I need a housekeeper and you need somewhere safe to stay. I'll pay you fair wages and you can leave whenever you please." Ruby couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She had expected the worst, and instead found herself facing an unexpected act of kindness from a complete stranger. "Why?" she finally managed to ask. Carson Black's expression remained stoic as he snapped the reins, urging the horses forward. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be treated as property. Nobody deserves that fate." As they left Yarrington behind, Ruby stole glances at her mysterious benefactor. The man who had just spent a small fortune to free her was now staring straight ahead, as if already regretting his impulsive act. But Ruby noticed how his hands, though calloused from hard work, handled the reins with gentle precision. Whatever Carson Black's story was, he wasn't the monster she had feared. The wagon rattled along the dusty road heading north, leaving behind the town and the life Ruby had known. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the first glimmer of hope she'd felt since her father's passing. She sat a little straighter on the hard wooden seat, allowing herself to believe that perhaps her future wasn't written in ashes after all. The journey to Carson's ranch took the better part of the day. They traveled mostly in silence, the rhythm of the horses' hooves and the creaking of the wagon wheels filling the space between them. Occasionally, Carson would point out a landmark or name a distant mountain peak, but otherwise kept to himself. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the Nevada landscape in shades of amber and gold, Ruby finally caught sight of a homestead nestled in a small valley. A modest but well-built two-story house stood surrounded by several outbuildings, corrals, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed. It wasn't the grandest ranch she'd ever seen, but everything about it spoke of care and hard work. "Black Pine Ranch," Carson announced as they approached. "It's not much, but it's mine." "It's beautiful," Ruby said honestly. After months of living in fear of what would become of her, the sight of this peaceful homestead felt like a sanctuary. As they pulled into the yard, a dog came bounding out to greet them, a large black and white border collie that barked enthusiastically until Carson gave a short whistle. The dog immediately quieted and sat, tail still wagging vigorously. "That's Scout," Carson said as he set the brake and jumped down from the wagon. "He's friendly, just noisy." He came around to Ruby's side and offered his hand to help her down. She hesitated just a moment before accepting it, noticing the strength in his grip as he easily lifted her from the seat. Once on the ground, he quickly released her hand, as if conscious of maintaining proper distance. "Mrs. Byon's been looking after the house while I was in town," he explained, leading the way to the porch. "She comes from the neighboring ranch a few times a week, but she's getting on in years. That's why I needed to hire someone permanent." The front door opened before they reached it, and an elderly woman with silver hair tied in a neat bun appeared. Her face was a map of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and assessing as they landed on Ruby. "So you found someone after all," she said by way of greeting, her voice carrying a hint of an Irish accent. Carson nodded. "Mrs. Byon, this is Miss Ruby Langston. She'll be taking over the housekeeping duties starting tomorrow." The older woman's gaze swept over Ruby, taking in her worn dress and uncertain posture. Something like understanding passed over her features. "Well then, come in, come in. I've got supper nearly ready and you both look like you could use a hot meal." The interior of the house surprised Ruby. While the outside was plain and practical, inside was clean and surprisingly comfortable. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a large stone fireplace at one end and a solid oak table at the other. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that spoke of an educated mind. Simple but attractive curtains framed the windows, and the furniture, though not new, was well maintained. "Your room will be upstairs, first door on the right," Carson said, setting Ruby's bag at the foot of the stairs. "Mine's at the end of the hall. The middle room is my office. Bathroom's out back, I'm afraid, though there's a washstand in your room." Ruby nodded, taking it all in. After months of uncertainty and the horror of being auctioned like livestock, she could scarcely believe her change in fortune. Yet doubt still lingered. Men didn't spend $500 without expecting something in return. As if reading her thoughts, Carson cleared his throat. "Miss Langston, I want to be clear about our arrangement. You'll be my housekeeper, nothing more. Your duties will include cooking, cleaning, laundry, and helping with the garden. In return, you'll receive room, board, and $15 a month, which is $5 more than I offered Mrs. Byon." Ruby's eyes widened at the sum. It was a generous wage for a housekeeper, especially one with no references or experience beyond keeping her own father's modest home. "That seems more than fair, Mr. Black." "Carson," he corrected her. "Just Carson is fine." Mrs. Byon emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Supper's on the table. Nothing fancy, just beef stew and biscuits." She turned to Ruby with a kind smile. "I'll show you around the kitchen tomorrow before I head home, dear. It's simple enough, but every cook has their ways." The meal passed pleasantly enough, with Mrs. Byon carrying most of the conversation. She told Ruby about the ranch, the best day for baking bread Tuesday when the air wasn't too dry, and which local merchants gave fair prices. Carson ate quietly, occasionally answering a direct question but otherwise seeming lost in thought. After supper, Mrs. Byon departed for her own home, promising to return in the morning. Carson showed Ruby to her room, a simple but clean space with a comfortable-looking bed, a pine dresser, a small washstand, and a rocking chair by the window that overlooked the front of the property. "Get some rest," he said awkwardly, lingering in the doorway. "You've had a difficult day." Ruby turned from examining the room to face him. In the soft glow of the oil lamp, the hard lines of his face seemed less severe. "Mr. Black, Carson, I don't know how to thank you for what you did today." He shook his head, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "No need for thanks. What your stepmother did wasn't right. I just happened to be in a position to do something about it. Still, $500 is a fortune. I don't know how I'll ever repay." "You won't," he interrupted firmly. That money bought your freedom, not my ownership. You don't owe me anything beyond the work we've agreed upon." He stepped back into the hallway. "Good night, Miss Langston." "Ruby," she said softly. "If I'm to call you Carson, then please call me Ruby." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. But he only nodded once before closing the door, leaving Ruby alone with her thoughts. She sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing the events of the day to wash over her. The terror of the auction block, the humiliation of being sold, the shock of her unexpected rescue, it was almost too much to process. Tears she'd been holding back all day finally spilled down her cheeks, but they were as much from relief as from trauma. Whatever Carson Black's reasons for helping her, she was safe for now. She had a roof over her head, honest work, and the promise of wages that would allow her to build a future of her own choosing. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself, but it was far better than the fate she'd feared just hours ago. As exhaustion finally overcame her, Ruby's last thoughts before drifting off to sleep were of blue eyes and the flame that had consumed her contract, setting her free. Dawn arrived with the crowing of a rooster and the soft glow of early sunlight filtering through the simple curtains. Ruby woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the memories of the previous day rushed back. She lay still for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, distant lowing of cattle, the neigh of horses, and the bustle of early morning activity outside. Determined to prove her worth from the start, Ruby quickly washed, dressed in her second-best dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days but was clean and serviceable, and made her way downstairs. To her surprise, the kitchen wasn't empty. Carson stood at the stove, frying bacon in a cast-iron skillet. He glanced up at her entrance, seeming almost embarrassed to be caught cooking. "You're up. Didn't expect you this early after yesterday's ordeal." "I'm used to early risings," Ruby replied, moving toward the stove. "Please let me take over. This is my job now, after all." Carson stepped aside, relinquishing the spatula. "Coffee's brewing. I usually have a simple breakfast: eggs, bacon, sometimes flapjacks, nothing fancy." Ruby nodded, already assessing the kitchen. It was well organized but clearly a man's domain, with practical tools but few of the touches a woman might add. Still, the stove was a good one, and the pantry she glimpsed through a side door seemed well stocked. "What time do you usually eat dinner? Midday dinner, I mean?" she asked, testing the bacon with the spatula. "Around noon when I can. Sometimes I'm out with the herd and can't make it back. In that case, I take something with me." He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her work. "Mrs. Bryan left a list of the weekly chores on the table there. You can adjust it as you see fit." Ruby found her rhythm quickly, adding eggs to the skillet once the bacon was done. As she worked, Carson told her about the ranch: 200 head of cattle, a dozen horses, chickens for eggs, a large vegetable garden behind the house, and an orchard with apple and pear trees that would fruit later in the summer. "It's a lot for one man to manage," Ruby observed as she set a plate of food before him at the table. Carson shrugged. "I hire hands for the big jobs: roundup, branding, harvest. Day to day I manage." He paused, watching as she served herself a much smaller portion. "You should eat more." "There's plenty." Ruby hesitated, then added another egg to her plate. Years of living with her stepmother had taught her to take less, speak less, be less. It would take time to unlearn those habits. They ate in companionable silence until Mrs. Bryan arrived, bustling in with a basket of fresh eggs. "Ah, you're up and about already. Good, good. We've much to go over today." The morning passed in a flurry of activity as Mrs. Bryan showed Ruby around the house, explaining Carson's preferences and routines. The older woman was kind but thorough, leaving nothing to chance. "He's a good man," Mrs. Byron said quietly as they hung laundry on the line behind the house. "Keeps to himself mostly, but fair and honest. Never raises his voice, never comes home drunk like some men do." Ruby sensed there was something the older woman wanted to say but wasn't quite asking. "He rescued me yesterday," she said simply, deciding honesty was best. "My stepmother sold me at auction to pay her debts. Mr. Black Carson bought my contract and then burned it. Said he needed a housekeeper but wouldn't own a person." Mrs. Byron nodded slowly, her weathered face softening. "That sounds like him. He knows a thing or two about being treated as property, though he doesn't speak of it." Ruby wanted to ask what the woman meant, but Carson appeared around the corner of the house, leading a saddled horse. He changed into riding clothes chaps over his trousers, a different hat, and a bandana around his neck. "I'm riding out to check the north pasture," he called. "Won't be back until supper. Mrs. Byron, will you be staying for the noon meal?" The older woman shook her head. "My son's expecting me back. I've shown Ruby everything she needs to know for now." She turned to Ruby with a kind smile. "You come find me if you have any questions, dear. The Byron place is just 2 miles east. Can't miss it." After Mrs. Byron departed and Carson rode out, Ruby found herself alone at Black Pine Ranch. The silence was both peaceful and daunting. For the first time in years, no one was watching over her shoulder, criticizing her work or her appearance. She was, in a strange way, her own woman. Ruby threw herself into her new duties with determination. She baked bread, churned butter, scrubbed floors, and explored every corner of the house to familiarize herself with her domain. By late afternoon, she had prepared a hearty beef stew for supper, and even found time to mend a torn curtain in the parlor. As the sun began its descent, Ruby heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. From the kitchen window, she watched Carson dismount, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. There was an easy grace to his movements as he cared for his horse before making his way to the house. "Something smells good," he said as he entered, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Beef stew," Ruby replied, suddenly nervous about her cooking. "And fresh bread. I hope that's all right." "More than all right," he smiled, a rare expression that transformed his serious face. "I haven't had homemade bread in weeks." Carson washed up at the pump outside, and they sat down to the evening meal. Ruby had set the table with care, using the good dishes she'd found in a cabinet, and even adding a small vase of wildflowers she'd picked near the garden. "You've been busy," Carson observed, looking around at the notably cleaner kitchen. Ruby nodded, watching anxiously as he tasted the stew. "Is it acceptable?" "It's excellent." He broke off a piece of bread, steam rising as he pulled it apart. "You didn't have to do all this on your first day." "I wanted to," she said simply. "It feels good to be useful." A comfortable silence fell between them as they ate. Ruby found herself studying him when he wasn't looking the way the lamplight caught the angles of his face, the careful precision of his movements, the distant look that occasionally crossed his features, as if he were remembering something far away. "Tell me about yourself," Carson said suddenly, breaking into her thoughts. "Where are you from originally?" Ruby hesitated, unused to anyone taking an interest in her past. "California, originally. My father was a school teacher there until my mother died. Then we moved to Nevada for a fresh start." She traced the pattern on her plate with her finger. "He married Meredith about 2 years ago, thinking I needed a mother figure. When he died this winter, she changed, started gambling, drinking. When the money ran out, well..." She trailed off, not wanting to relive the humiliation again. Carson's jaw tightened. "Your father would never have approved of what she did." "No," Ruby agreed softly. "He would have been heartbroken." She looked up, finding Carson's blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "What about you? Have you always been a rancher?" Something shuddered in his expression. "Not always, no. I came west 10 years ago, worked as a cowhand until I saved enough to buy this place 5 years back." He offered no further details, and Ruby sensed it would be unwise to push. After supper, Carson insisted on helping with the dishes despite Ruby's protests that it was her job. They worked side by side in the kitchen, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed plates between them. Each accidental touch sent a strange flutter through Ruby's stomach, a sensation she wasn't sure how to interpret. Later, as Ruby prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the enigmatic man whose roof she was now under. Carson Black was unlike any man she'd met before, reserved yet kind, authoritative yet respectful. And beneath his controlled exterior, she sensed there were depths of experience and perhaps pain that he kept carefully guarded. As she drifted off to sleep, Ruby realized that for the first time in months she felt safe. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she was protected, respected, and strangely at peace in this house of a man she barely knew. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Ruby rose early each morning to prepare breakfast and see Carson off to his daily tasks. She spent her days cooking, cleaning, tending the vegetable garden, and slowly adding small feminine touches to the house: a cushion here, a vase of flowers there, curtains she sewed from fabric Carson brought back from town. For his part, Carson seemed to appreciate the changes she brought to his home. He commented on how much brighter the house seemed, how good it felt to come home to the smell of cooking and the sight of a well-kept home. But he maintained a careful distance between them, unfailingly polite, but never familiar. Yet Ruby couldn't help noticing the way his eyes sometimes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking, or how he found reasons to be in whatever room she was working in. Small gestures bringing her wildflowers he'd found while riding, ordering books from the mercantile that he thought she might enjoy, asking her opinion on ranch matters suggested he valued her presence beyond her role as housekeeper. As May turned to June, the Nevada summer began in earnest, with days growing hotter and longer. On one particularly sweltering afternoon, Ruby was hanging laundry when she spotted Carson riding in at an unusual hour, another man beside him. She shielded her eyes against the sun, watching as they dismounted and approached the house. "Ruby," Carson called, removing his hat as he neared. "This is Sheriff Mills from Yarrington." Ruby froze, her heart suddenly pounding. Had her stepmother reported her missing? Was the sheriff here to return her to Meredith? The sheriff, a grizzled man with kind eyes, tipped his hat to her. "Miss Langston, good to see you looking well." Carson must have sensed her fear because he quickly added, "The sheriff has news about your stepmother." "Let's go inside where it's cooler." In the relative coolness of the kitchen, Ruby served coffee with trembling hands as the sheriff settled at the table. "Miss Langston, your stepmother left town about 2 weeks after you did," Sheriff Mills explained. But not before trying the same trick again with another young woman. Only this time, the girl's uncle discovered the plan and raised a ruckus. "When I investigated, I found evidence that Meredith Langston had been forging your father's signature on bank drafts for months before his death." Ruby sat heavily in a chair. "She was stealing even before he died," the sheriff nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so. She fled before we could arrest her, but word came yesterday that authorities caught up with her in Sacramento. She's facing charges of fraud and attempted human trafficking." A strange mixture of relief and grief washed over Ruby. While she had no love left for her stepmother, the finality of knowing the woman who had been her last family connection was now headed for prison hit hard. "There's something else," the sheriff continued, pulling a document from his vest pocket. "Your father's will has been reviewed by the circuit judge. It seems your stepmother suppressed it after his death, but a clerk at the county office found a copy. According to the will, your father left his entire estate to you, including funds from the sale of his California property that Meredith never reported." Ruby stared at the document the sheriff slid across the table. I don't understand." "It means," Carson said quietly, "that you're not destitute after all. You have an inheritance that's rightfully yours." The sheriff nodded. "The judge has ordered the bank to release the funds to you comes to just over $2,000. It's all detailed here." He tapped the paper. "You'll need to come to Yarrington next week to sign some documents, but then the money is yours to do with as you please." $2,000. It was a fortune enough to buy property, start a business, or simply live comfortably for years without working. Ruby's mind reeled with possibilities. After the sheriff departed, promising to send word when Ruby needed to come to town, a heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Carson stood by the window, his back to her, shoulders tense. "This is wonderful news," he finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "You're a woman of independent means now." Ruby studied his rigid posture, suddenly understanding. "You think I'll leave?" He turned then, his expression guarded. "You're free to do so. You always were, but now you have the means to go wherever you wish, do whatever you choose. And if I choose to stay—" The words slipped out before she could consider them fully. Carson's eyes widened slightly, a flash of something hope, crossing his features before he controlled it. "Your position here is secure for as long as you want it, Ruby, but you shouldn't feel obligated. You're a young woman with prospects now. You might want to move to a larger town, perhaps find a suitable husband. Is that what you think I want?" Ruby interrupted, rising from her chair. 2 months ago, she would never have had the courage to speak so directly, but life at Black Pine Ranch had changed her. "To leave here and find some suitable man to marry?" Carson looked genuinely puzzled. "Isn't that what most young women desire? Security, family, position in society." Ruby moved closer to him, her heart pounding with a boldness she hadn't known she possessed. "What I desire, Carson Black, is to be somewhere I feel safe and valued, to be with people who see me as a person, not property or a prospect." She took a deep breath. "I've found that here." His expression softened, but uncertainty remained in his eyes. "Ruby, I'm 10 years your senior, a man with a past I don't speak of, living on a remote ranch miles from town. This is hardly the life a young woman dreams of." "Perhaps you should let me decide what I dream of," she replied quietly. For a long moment they stood in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then Carson stepped back, breaking the tension. "Think on it," he said gently. "This news is fresh and you've had no time to consider your options. Whatever you decide, I'll support your choice." With that, he retrieved his hat and headed back outside, leaving Ruby alone with thoughts and emotions she was only beginning to understand. The day Ruby was to travel to Yarrington arrived hot and clear. Carson insisted on accompanying her, claiming he had business in town but clearly unwilling to let her face her stepmother's mess alone. They set out early before the worst of the day's heat, in Carson's wagon. The journey passed mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Ruby had spent the week since the sheriff's visit pondering her future. The inheritance opened possibilities she had never imagined, yet whenever she tried to picture herself elsewhere, in a fine house in Virginia City perhaps, or even back in California, the image felt wrong somehow. At the county courthouse, Ruby signed the necessary documents with a steady hand. The bank manager presented her with a bank draft and documents establishing her account, treating her with the deference reserved for wealthy clients. It was a strange feeling for a young woman who had stood on an auction block just months before. "Would you like to make any withdrawals today, Miss Langston?" the banker inquired. Ruby glanced at Carson, who waited by the door, his expression unreadable. "Yes," she decided suddenly. $500, please." When their business was concluded, Carson suggested lunch at the hotel before the return journey. The hotel dining room was the finest establishment in Yerington, and Ruby felt conscious of her simple dress among the more fashionable ladies present. Yet Carson seemed oblivious to their surroundings, his attention fully on her. "You look pleased," he observed as they waited for their meal. "I'm glad things went smoothly," Ruby nodded. "It still doesn't seem real. To go from being sold like cattle to having more money than I ever thought I'd see in my lifetime." "Life can change in an instant," Carson agreed, something distant in his eyes. "For better or worse." Ruby sensed he was speaking from experience and not a happy one. Gathering her courage, she placed a hand over his on the table. "Carson, there's something I need to say." He looked at her hand on his, then met her eyes with a questioning gaze. "When you bought my contract that day, you gave me freedom I thought I'd lost forever," she began. "These months at Black Pine have been. I've found myself there in a way I never expected." She took a deep breath. "I don't want to leave." His expression remained guarded. "Ruby, you don't need to decide now. You should take time, perhaps visit other places before I've decided," she interrupted gently. "And to prove it." She reached into her reticule and pulled out a bank draft, sliding it across the table to him. Carson glanced down, then looked up sharply. $500. "Ruby, what is this?" "The exact amount you paid for my freedom," she said softly. "I'm repaying you." He pushed the draft back toward her. "I told you that wasn't necessary. I didn't help you expecting repayment." "I know," Ruby persisted. "But as long as that debt existed between us, there would always be an imbalance. Now we're equals. And as your equal, I'm telling you I want to stay at Black Pine Ranch not as your housekeeper but as whatever we might become to each other." Carson stared at her, a tumult of emotions crossing his face: disbelief, hope, and something deeper that made Ruby's heart race. "Ruby," he said hoarsely, "you don't know what you're saying. You don't know who I really am, where I come from." "Then tell me," she challenged softly. "Tell me who Carson Black really is." He glanced around the crowded dining room, then shook his head. "Not here. On the way home." The return journey began in tense silence. Ruby waited patiently as Carson guided the horses along the dusty road out of town. Finally, when the buildings of Yerington were well behind them, he spoke. "My real name is Carson Blackwood," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I was born in Georgia to a plantation owner and one of his slaves." Ruby gasped softly but remained silent, allowing him to continue. "My mother died when I was young. My father acknowledged me as his son, educated me alongside my half-brothers, but I was never truly family. When the war came, he joined the Confederacy. I was 17, caught between worlds, not white enough for one side, not black enough for the other." His hands tightened on the reins. "After the war, things got worse. My father died, and my half-brothers didn't honor his wish that I receive a portion of the estate. Instead, they tried to force me into a labor contract that was slavery in all but name." "So you left," Ruby said quietly. Carson nodded. "I fled west, changed my name to just Black, worked whatever jobs I could find, eventually found my way into ranching, saved every penny until I could buy my own place where no one could own me or control me again." He glanced at her briefly. "That day in Yerington, when I saw you on that auction block, I couldn't stand by and watch another human being sold like property." Ruby's heart ached for the boy he had been, for the man who had fought for his freedom and dignity. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "Now you understand," Carson said, his voice tight, "why this can't work. In Georgia, a man like me could be killed for even looking at a white woman. Here in Nevada, people might be more tolerant, but they'd still talk. Your reputation would be ruined. You think I care about that?" Ruby asked, indignant. "After everything I've been through, do you think I give a fig what people say?" "You should," he insisted. "You have options now, Ruby. You don't have to tie yourself to a man of mixed race, a man with no family, no connections. Is that really what you think of yourself?" She demanded. "Because it's not what I see when I look at you. I see a man of honor and courage, a man who built something from nothing through his own hard work, a man who spent a fortune to save a stranger because it was the right thing to do." Her voice softened. "A man I've come to care for deeply." Carson pulled the wagon to a stop in the shade of a large cottonwood tree. He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes searching hers. "You say that now, but what about in a year? 5 years? When people whisper behind your back, when shopkeepers treat you differently, when children ask why their mother looks different from their father." Ruby's heart skipped at his mention of children, their children. "Is that what you want, Carson? A family with me?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment, his carefully maintained control slipped and the longing in his eyes took her breath away. "What I want doesn't matter," he said roughly. "I've learned that lesson well." "It matters to me," Ruby insisted, reaching for his hand. "Tell me truly, if the world were different, if there were no prejudice or judgment, what would you want between us?" Carson looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. "If the world were different," he said slowly, "I would court you properly. I would ask permission to call on you, bring you flowers, take you on Sunday drives. I would tell you that from the moment I saw you, so proud despite your circumstances, I felt something I've never felt before." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "And eventually, I would ask you to be my wife." Ruby's heart soared at his words. "Then ask me," she said simply. "Court me, marry me. The world may not be perfect, but we can build our own world at Black Pine Ranch." "Ruby," he breathed her name like a prayer. "Are you certain? Once this step is taken, there's no going back." In answer, Ruby did something that would have scandalized her father and every proper person she'd ever known. She leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to Carson's. It was a brief kiss, innocent and sweet, but it held a promise that needed no words. When she pulled back, Carson's expression was transformed wonder, joy, and a fierce protectiveness that made her feel safer than she ever had before. "I'm certain," Ruby whispered. Carson touched her cheek with a gentleness that belied his strength. "Then I'll ask properly. Miss Ruby Langston, would you do me the honor of allowing me to court you with the intention of making you my wife?" Ruby smiled, tears of happiness gathering in her eyes. "Yes, Mr. Carson Black, I would like that very much." The summer passed in a golden haze of happiness. True to his word, Carson courted Ruby properly, driving her to church on Sundays, bringing her wildflowers and small gifts from town, reading to her in the evenings by lamplight. They still maintained separate rooms and proper decorum, but their relationship had transformed into something deeper and more meaningful than employer and housekeeper. News of their courtship spread quickly through the small ranching community. Some, like Mrs. Byan and her family, were supportive. Others reacted with predictable prejudice. The first time Ruby entered the general store on Carson's arm and received cold looks from some of the patrons, she felt a flash of anger on his behalf. "Ignore them," Carson murmured, his hand steady at her waist. "Their opinions don't matter to me." "Nor to me," Ruby replied, loud enough for others to hear. She selected her items with deliberate care, her head held high. As they left the store, an elderly man spat on the ground near Carson's boots. Before Carson could react, Ruby stepped forward, fire in her eyes. "You should be ashamed," she said clearly. "This man fought for his freedom just like your sons fought for this country. He built a successful ranch with his own 2 hands and treats everyone with dignity more than I can say for you, sir." The man looked startled, then abashed as murmurs of agreement came from several onlookers. Carson gently led Ruby away, a mixture of pride and concern in his eyes. "That was both brave and foolish," he told her when they were alone in the wagon. "You can't change people's minds so easily." "Perhaps not," Ruby agreed, "but I won't stand by silently either. If we're to have a future together, we must be willing to face these challenges head-on." Carson studied her for a long moment, then broke into a rare, full smile. "You are unlike any woman I've ever known, Ruby Langston." "Is that a good thing?" she teased. "The very best," he assured her, lifting her hand to his lips. As summer gave way to autumn, Ruby used some of her inheritance to make improvements to Black Pine Ranch. She ordered new furniture for the parlor, had a proper bathroom installed inside the house, and expanded the garden with plans for the coming spring. Each change was discussed with Carson first, their partnership growing stronger as they made decisions together about their future home. On a crisp October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Carson took Ruby's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about something you said months ago about building our own world here." Ruby turned to him, curious. "Yes. I realize that's exactly what we've been doing, and I don't want to wait any longer to make it official." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. "This was my mother's. Somehow she managed to keep it hidden all her life. My father gave it to me before he died, the one acknowledgement that he truly cared for her." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "It's not grand, but it's beautiful," Ruby breathed, touched beyond words that he would offer her something so precious to his past. Carson slid from his chair to one knee before her. "Ruby Langston, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me, face whatever comes our way together, grow old with me on this land that's become our sanctuary?" Tears spilled down Ruby's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, Carson. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms. This time their kiss was not brief or hesitant but deep and filled with promise, sealing their commitment to each other under the vast Nevada sky. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at Black Pine Ranch. Judge Thompson, a fair-minded man who had befriended Carson years earlier, performed the service. Mrs. Bryan and her family attended, along with Sheriff Mills and a few neighboring ranchers who had come to respect Carson's work ethic and Ruby's spirit. If some invitees declined to attend a marriage between a mixed-race man and a white woman, neither Carson nor Ruby allowed it to dampen their joy. Ruby wore a new dress of ivory silk ordered from San Francisco, while Carson cut a handsome figure in a new black suit. They exchanged vows beneath an arch of autumn branches Ruby had decorated with late-blooming wildflowers. Their hands joined as they promised to love and honor each other for all their days. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Thompson declared with genuine warmth. "Mr. and Mrs. Carson Black." As Carson kissed his bride to the applause of their small gathering of friends, Ruby felt a sense of completion she had never known before. From the auction block to this moment of pure joy, it seemed impossible. Yet here they stood, united in love and determination to forge their own path. Later, after their guests had departed and night had fallen, Carson carried Ruby across the threshold of their home, truly their home now. In the privacy of what was now their bedroom, they discovered each other fully for the first time, their passion tempered by tenderness as they consummated their union. "I love you, Ruby Black," Carson whispered in the darkness, her name on his lips sounding like the most precious of vows. "And I love you," she responded, curled against his strength. "Always." The years that followed brought both joy and challenges to Black Pine Ranch. Ruby and Carson worked side by side to expand their holdings, adding adjacent land when it became available, increasing their herd, and establishing a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. In their second year of marriage, Ruby gave birth to a son they named James, after Carson's birth father. The following year brought twin daughters, Sarah and Elizabeth. Each child was a perfect blend of their parents, James with Ruby's auburn hair but Carson's blue eyes, the girls with their father's darker complexion but their mother's delicate features. Raising mixed-race children in 1880s, Nevada was not without difficulties. There were whispers in town, occasional cruel comments from strangers, but Ruby and Carson had built a strong community of friends who stood by them, and they taught their children to face prejudice with dignity rather than anger. "Your worth isn't determined by others' opinions," Carson often told his children. "It's in your actions, your integrity, your kindness." As the children grew, so did Black Pine Ranch's prosperity. Carson's innovative ranching methods and Ruby's shrewd business sense honed through careful study and practice made their operation one of the most successful in the region. They added a new wing to the house, established a small school on the property where Ruby taught their children and those of neighboring ranchers, and became known for their hospitality. On the 10th anniversary of the day Carson had purchased and burned Ruby's contract, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard as the setting sun gilded the landscape. "You ever think about that day?" Ruby asked, her hand resting comfortably in her husband's. At 30, she had matured into a confident, graceful woman, respected throughout the county for her intelligence and compassion. Carson, his dark hair now threaded with silver at the temples, nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes. It was the best $500 I ever spent." He smiled at her, the love in his eyes undimmed by the passing years. "Though I never expected such a return on my investment." Ruby laughed, leaning against his shoulder. "And I never expected the auction block would lead me to happiness." "Mama, Papa, look," 6-year-old James called, pointing to the horizon where the first stars were appearing. "I found the North Star, just like you showed me." Carson beckoned his son closer. "Well done. That star has guided many travelers home when they were lost." Ruby watched her husband and son, then glanced at her daughters gathering wildflowers nearby. Her heart swelled with gratitude for this family they had created, this haven of love and acceptance in a world that wasn't always kind. "We've come a long way from Yarrington," she murmured. Carson squeezed her hand. "And we've many miles yet to travel together." As darkness settled over Black Pine Ranch, the lamps inside their home cast a warm, welcoming glow. The children were called in for supper, their laughter filling the house that had once been so silent and empty. In the kitchen that had once been Carson's lonely domain, the family gathered around the table, joined hands, and gave thanks for their blessings. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Carson and Ruby stood together by their bedroom window, gazing out at the land that had become their legacy. "You ever regret it?" Carson asked suddenly. "Choosing this life, choosing me when you could have gone anywhere, done anything?" Ruby turned to face him, taking his beloved face between her hands. "Not for a single moment," she said with absolute conviction. "You saved me from bondage, Carson Black, but more than that, you showed me what it means to be truly free. Free to choose, free to love, free to build something meaningful together." He drew her into his arms, still marveling after all these years that this extraordinary woman had chosen him. "I think perhaps we saved each other." As they held each other in the moonlight that spilled across their bedroom floor, Ruby reflected on the strange, wonderful journey that had brought them to this point. From the humiliation of being sold to the highest bidder to finding the deepest love with the man who had refused to own her life, had indeed taken unexpected turns. Outside their window, the vast Nevada sky sparkled with stars, witnesses to their unlikely love story. Inside, the steady beating of their hearts promised many more chapters yet to unfold, challenges to face, joys to celebrate, a future to build together, hand in hand, completely and irrevocably free. 20 years after that fateful day at the auction block, Black Pine Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous properties in Nevada. What had once been Carson's modest homestead now encompassed over 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, orchards, and fields. The original house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family and frequent guests, though Ruby had insisted on preserving the core of the original structure where their love had first bloomed. Their children had grown into fine young adults. James, at 19, had his father's quiet strength and his mother's quick mind. After 2 years at a university in California, something neither Carson nor Ruby had ever dreamed possible for themselves, he had returned to help manage the ranch, bringing new ideas and techniques he'd learned. The twins, Sarah and Elizabeth, 18 and as different as two sisters could be, were preparing for their own futures. Sarah, artistic and independent, had shown remarkable talent as a painter and had been accepted to study art in San Francisco. Elizabeth, practical and nurturing, planned to become a teacher and had already begun assisting Ruby with lessons for the younger children of ranch workers. 2 more children had joined the family over the years: Robert, now 15, who shared his father's gift with horses, and little Catherine, a surprise blessing who had arrived when Ruby was 40, now a precocious 5-year-old who followed her eldest brother everywhere. On a warm June evening in 1898, the family gathered to celebrate Carson and Ruby's 20th wedding anniversary. Long tables had been set up in the orchard, lanterns hanging from tree branches casting a golden glow over the assembled guests, neighbors, friends, and extended family members who had come from as far as California and even Georgia, where Carson had reconnected with cousins on his mother's side. Ruby, still beautiful at 45 with strands of silver now mingling with her auburn hair, stood beside Carson as James raised a toast. "To my parents," their eldest son said, his voice strong and clear in the evening air, "who taught us that love doesn't see color or circumstance, only the truth of a person's heart, who built this ranch not just with their hands but with courage and vision, who showed us that the greatest freedom comes not from wealth or position, but from choosing one's own path and standing by that choice, whatever may come." Glasses clinked as voices called out, "Here, here." Carson, his once dark hair now liberally streaked with gray, slipped his arm around Ruby's waist, the gesture as natural as breathing after 2 decades of marriage. Later, as musicians played and guests danced on a wooden platform constructed for the occasion, Carson led Ruby away from the celebration to a quiet spot beneath the very cottonwood tree where, 20 years earlier, he had first confessed his feelings. "You remember this place?" he asked, taking both her hands in his. Ruby smiled, the lines at the corners of her eyes deepening. "How could I forget? It was where you finally admitted you wanted to court me. After you kissed me," Carson reminded her with a chuckle. "You were always the braver one." "I prefer to think we were brave together," Ruby countered softly. It took courage for you to stop at that auction to spend your savings on a stranger. Carson shook his head. Not courage. I couldn't have done otherwise. But loving you, believing I deserved your love in return, that took courage I didn't know I possessed. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box similar to the one he had presented on the night of his proposal. I had this made for you, for 20 years together. Ruby opened it to find a gold locket, exquisitely crafted. Inside were 2 miniature photographs, one of them on their wedding day, young and hopeful, and one taken just last month, their faces lined with experience but their eyes still bright with love. "Carson," she breathed, deeply touched. "It's beautiful. You've given me so much, Ruby," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "A family, a true home, a life fuller and richer than I ever dared dream." "We built it together," she reminded him, echoing his earlier words. She fastened the locket around her neck, where it nestled beside the simple gold band. She still wore on a chain her stepmother's contract ring, kept as a reminder of how far she had come. Every step of the way together. From the direction of the orchard came the sound of laughter as their youngest daughter Catherine apparently did something amusing, judging by the crowd's reaction. Carson and Ruby smiled at each other, the decades of shared experiences flowing between them without need for words. "We should get back," Ruby said eventually. "It's our party after all." Carson nodded but didn't immediately move. Instead, he drew her into his arms for a kiss that, even after 20 years, still sent warmth spreading through her body. "I love you, Ruby Black," he whispered against her lips. "More with each passing day." "And I love you," she answered, her arms around his neck. "My freedom, my heart, my home." Hand in hand, they walked back to the celebration, to the family they had created, to the community that had grown to accept and even celebrate their union. The path hadn't always been smooth. There had been those who never accepted them, hardships that tested their resolve, moments of doubt and fear. But through it all, they had held fast to each other and to the truth they had discovered that long ago day in Yarrington. That love, freely given and freely accepted, was the greatest power on earth. As they rejoined their guests, Ruby caught sight of their children James discussing ranch business with neighboring cattlemen, the twins dancing with young men who looked at them with admiring eyes, Robert proudly showing off a new colt to interested onlookers, and little Catherine being swung between her older brother's hands, her laughter bright in the summer evening. This was their legacy, Ruby thought with pride. Not just the prosperous ranch or the respected Black name, but these children who carried forward the values she and Carson had lived by: courage, compassion, and the unshakable belief that every person deserved the freedom to chart their own course. From unlikely beginnings, a mixed-race man fighting for recognition in a prejudiced world, and a young woman sold on an auction block, they had forged something remarkable. Their story, Ruby knew, would be told and retold for generations to come, a testament to the power of one decisive moment when a cowboy paid the highest bid and burned the contract papers, setting in motion a love story that defied all expectations. As the celebration continued around them, Carson caught Ruby's eye across the gathering and smiled the special smile he reserved only for her. In that moment, as in countless moments before, Ruby felt the absolute certainty that had guided her since the day she chose this life. That no fortune could have purchased what she had found at Black Pine Ranch, and no contract could ever define the freedom of a heart truly, completely loved.